Because foraging in the US, like many things, has a really complicated past that has a lot to do with these things. Yup, no trespassing signs. In other words, no foraging here. But what if I told you that no trespassing laws were specifically designed years ago to stop people who looked like Alexis from foraging?
Hey guys, welcome back to my channel here. It's Lavender here, and today, comrades, I'm back with another video. Today I want to do the true crime dark history, the dark history of freedom to forage, the dark history of foraging, black people foraging, soul food, and trespassing laws, and the history of it, a deep dive into this topic. So let's get started in this video. So the dark history behind it. So this is how it goes. In America, racial oppression didn't obviously end when slavery was abolished in 1865. People of color were still considered second-class citizens, with segregation continuing until 1964. They were still oppressed despite what the U.S. government tells you to this day. Following the ban of slavery, even though most of the black American community was considered freemen, they were still living under a system that was actively trying to control and oppress them at every turn, whether that is work labor, like working, financial-wise, food, etc. The U.S. government was trying in every way to oppress people of color just for existing. Foraging had been a part of these ex-slaves and other people of color, indigenous communities' lives, having turned to wild food to supplement the often nutrient-deficient diet provided by the slave owners. From the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, food was both a form of resistance for a tool of control over enslaved people. Over the course of 400 years, millions of enslaved Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas and the Caribbean across the Atlantic Ocean. Food was an important element of this process. Rations were significantly calculated to provide the cheapest minimal nutrition to keep enslaved people alive. Again, this is a nutrient-deficient diet. While pork was a dominant food source for free white Southerners, enslaved people were even more reliant on pork as a meat source. Pork, along with corn, was the primary ration issued to slaves on many plantations. Though rations could vary widely, slaves typically received an average of 3 pounds of pork per week. Slaves, however, would usually be issued what was considered to be lesser cuts of the hog, the cheapest cuts, the nasty cuts, such as the feet, head, ribs, fat back, or internal organs of the pig, of the hog, of the pork. To hide the poor flavor of these cuts, enslaved people drew inspiration from traditional African cooking methods and used a powerful mixture of red pepper mixed with vinegar on their meat to give it some flavor. So due to this deficient diet and lack of fruits and healthy veggies, they turned to foraging. Slaves would gather and boil various kinds of leafy foods via foraging, such as collard greens, kale, the tops of beets, turnips, or even wild weeds, aka foraging. In various instances, slaves boiled greens that were traditional to some Native American cuisines and cultures, such as marsh marigold and milkweed. The sweet potato is native to the Americas as well, and was a familiar staple to many Native nations' diets and their cultures, posing a strikingly similar resemblance to the yams of West Africa. Enslaved people would apply their traditions and techniques previously reserved for yams. They would do the same thing, but to the sweet potato with relatively ease. When freed from forced slave labor, many families turned to these established foraging method and practices to provide food on the table for their families and also income. Despite having a little income and restricted freedoms, communities could still enjoy nutrient-dense wild foods until now. In a premeditated effort to restrict the independence of the recently freed black slaves in the black community in the fascist regime known as America, states brought in anti-foraging laws that criminalized trespassing and harvesting wild foods from public spaces. With few options, this forced many to return back to work for their former slave owners to put food on their tables. Black people didn't work and they were actually arrested and did slave prison labor. The end of the Civil War marked the end of slavery for 4 million black Southerners, but the war also left them landless and with little money to support themselves. White Southerners and racists seeking to control the freedmen, the former slaves, devised special state law codes. Many Northerners saw these codes as blatant attempts to restore slavery via the chain gangs. They were arrested just for not working. They would literally be arrested for that and put in a chain gang. The history of early America anti-foraging laws reveals that supporters of restricting foraging rights typically grounded their efforts in racism, classism, colonialism, imperialism, or some combination of these oddities, practices, and beliefs. Foraging has enjoyed a surge in popularity in recent times, with famous chefs rediscovering it and encouraging others to put in their food and make it more vibrant and exciting. It's a way to connect with the nature where you live, enhance your diet, and, be more connected with your roots and ties. Recently, indigenous tribes have been foraging and hunting sustainably on this earth. They protect the land as well. Now, certain fascist regimes are now labeling them as poachers and are frequently incarcerated, arrested, and tried and beaten for foraging and hunting on their ancestral lands. During colonization, European colonizers banned indigenous peoples and native peoples from subsisting, aka living off the land, foraging, gathering meals, while simultaneously relying on the same forage species they were against. In the United States, the 1830 Indian Removal Act violently relocated nations to unfamiliar land, further inhibiting their ability to gather plants. When indigenous people were forced onto reservations, they were largely forbidden from gathering food on the land or to even hunt. The European colonizers regarded these indigenous peoples and their practices as primitive hunter-gatherers due to their foraging practices, which were used to justify their forceful relocation. Missionaries and other evil colonizers also set about, basically destroying native culture and stuff as well. And due to this, farming by colonizers and introducing non-native plant species to these areas, which had a large environmental implications. Medical plants used by indigenous peoples were forcibly taken by European colonists and continue to this day to be used by their descendants today. For example, sage. A lot of these white witches, these colonizer witches usually take sage and they just burn it, and it's disrespectful. In America, the laws imposed to restrict black and indigenous access to foraging and wild foods still stand to this day.